Hello, everyone, and good afternoon from here in Bronx, New York. My name is Patrick Hornbeck, and I'm the chair of the Department of Theology, an officer of the Faculty Senate, and special advisor to the provost here at Fordham University. And it's an incredible honor for me to play host and master of ceremonies this afternoon for our panel conversation on reopening justly or just reopening, Catholic social teaching, universities, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me start off by saying a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us for this webinar. I know some of you are still coming in as we get started, but we have nearly 300 guests joining us this afternoon, ranging from faculty members and students at universities across the country, to college presidents, chief academic officers, deans, members of the media, public officials, and members of the judiciary. A very, very warm welcome to all of you. We come together this afternoon in a setting that is unlike any other that most of us have experienced during our lifetimes. We're in the midst of a global pandemic, one that's combined with broad and outspoken activism in the area of racial justice, and in particular protest against the long-standing scourge of anti-Black racism. Both of these, and in particular the intersection of them, have highlighted long-standing and systemic forms of inequality and inequity. Catholic colleges and universities, like all colleges and universities, are considering their plans for reopening right at the intersection of these twin crises, the pandemic and the continued discovery, rediscovery, and highlighting of America's tradition and long-standing history of racism. These are what many people have called wicked problems, problems that are so complex as to defy any single solution. And they're problems that often require ethical triage, because every option, it seems, brings a potential for harm to someone in some way. So in the theology department here at Fordham, joined with the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies, our vision has been to bring together this panel of nationally recognized experts in Catholic social teaching and Christian ethics to help help us understand how Catholic colleges and universities should think about reopening decisions in light of the Catholic tradition's ethical principles. I'm grateful to be joined by our panelists, and I'll introduce them to you in a moment. But first, a special thanks to Michael Lee, the incoming director of the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies, to one of our panelists, Christine Ferrer-Hinsey, the outgoing director of the Curran Center and incoming chair of the theology department. Before we get started, I want to provide a little bit of guidance on using the tools for this Zoom webinar. At the bottom of your screen, one of the options you should see is a Q&A option. Because we want this conversation to be as dialogical as possible, we've chosen to make the Q&As public, which means that you can see not only your own question, but questions from other members of our now 174-person strong audience. There's also a feature, as questions come in, where you can upvote the questions that seem most significant to you. And we'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout the entire webinar, and we probably won't be able to get to all your questions, but we'll use this upvoting mechanism to discern the ones that have the greatest interest among our audience members. If you need to contact me or a member of our technical team, there's also a chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please do feel free to use that as well. Now, introducing our panelists. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order, but when they come to speak, they have decided on a predetermined order of their own. So first, Gerald J. Beyer is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at Villanova University. Among his publications are Recovering Solidarity, Lessons from Poland's Unfinished Revolution, published by Notre Dame in 2010, and a forthcoming book entitled Just Universities, Catholic Social Teaching Confronts Corporatized Higher Education, to be published here at Fordham by Fordham University Press in January of 2021. Professor Beyer recently wrote the short essay, COVID-19 and Higher Ed, published in the online forum of Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church. Next, Christine Ferrer-Hinsey is Professor of Theological Ethics and outgoing director of the Curran Center here at Fordham, as well as president-elect of the Catholic Theological Society of America. Her teaching and research focus on the dynamics of power and social transformation, US Catholic thought, an economic and work justice for vulnerable women, families, and groups. All subjects treated in her new book, forthcoming this October from Georgetown University Press, entitled Radical Sufficiency: Work, Livelihood, and a US Catholic Economic Ethic. Third, we have Craig A. Ford Jr., Assistant Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at St. Norbert College. He writes at the intersection of the Catholic moral tradition, queer theory, and critical race theory. His current research project seeks to provide a renewed vision for the Catholic natural law tradition that's not only held accountable for its history of homophobic, racist, and sexist violence, but that's also capable of being a constructive partner in conversations discerning liberatory futures for all persons. And last, but certainly not least, we have Professor Kate Ward, Assistant Professor of Theological Ethics at Marquette University. Her research focuses on economic ethics, ethical method in Catholic social thought, and she's currently completing a monograph on wealth, inequality, and the moral life for Georgetown University Press. If we were gathered in person, I'd ask you to join me in applauding and welcoming our panelists. But in this Zoom format, let me begin to just hand the floor over to each of them for a brief introduction, opening statements connecting Catholic social teaching with the reopening of our colleges and universities. Professor Fiorahinzi first.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for taking part of your day to be with us to ponder these realities. I don't know about you, but to me, it feels like we're in the midst of a very stormy, choppy sea right now, with the direction of our respective Catholic institutional ships unclear, lots of unpredictable changes in the current and the weather, and people feel buffeted about. I think many of us are just coming from meetings that make us feel that way and going to meetings that make us feel that way. So those of you who are gathered who are in Catholic institutions understand that from the inside, but everyone who's listening knows that this is a very difficult time, as Patrick put it so well. So what might Catholic social teaching, this modern tradition of thinking, of action, of discussion, of conversation, have to offer to us in this stormy, difficult, unpredictable situation? As many of you know, this has arisen out of the last century plus of papal social efforts to think about and talk about how Catholicism, how Christianity, how the gospel talks to or has relevance for the really messy, difficult social situations of the modern world, starting with the economic rights of vulnerable workers in the late 19th century, going all the way up to the environment and the climate crisis that Pope Francis speaks to us in most recently in the 21st century. These are difficult, messy questions, but the gospel sheds light according to this conviction, or this tradition, and it's worth getting into a discursive field or getting into a room where we converse with these particular principles that flow from the gospel and flow from this tradition on the table as ways of guiding ourselves. Oftentimes, you may see that these Catholic social thought is expressed in terms of a list of principles or themes: the God-given dignity of each person, the common good, structures of sin, justice, solidarity, subsidiarity, care for creation. As such, those kinds of lists easily fall prey to the facile or cheap sloganism that often threatens, let's be honest, the many beautiful maxims that festoon our own campuses and our own public rhetoric about what our mission is and why we see it as important. But in fact, both of those statements on our campus and the Catholic social tradition is much more than a list of slogans. And in fact, it's the distillation of the living, the struggling, the thinking, and the blood, sweat, and tears of actual people who've dedicated themselves to understanding and enacting love and truth in our messy social lives. So for our purposes, I think CST offers not a recipe, not a checklist, not a nice thing we can say, okay, we're doing these things, but rather I'd suggest a set of navigational markers, a kind of beacons or buoys in our stormy sea, which we're all in right now. as we navigate our respective little boats, and we decide who is in our armada that we need to care about as we move forward, these touchstone principles can help us navigate the harsh realities by orienting our seeing, judging, and acting in their light. I want to suggest that the CST perspective, if we infuse our thinking and judging and acting with a CST perspective as we look at reopening issues, we may fruitfully think in terms of how this perspective frames the way we approach and think about and act on issues of life and issues of livelihood, which we all know are very intertwined right now. I was just at a faculty meeting a chair's meeting in which one of the chairs says, we are dealing with life and death here. And it's not an exaggeration. And so we're dealing with people's lives, their health, their well-being, both on our campuses and off. We're also dealing with livelihood, which of course contributes to one's life and well-being. These are things that the Catholic social tradition values and puts centrally into their approach to how to deal with any social problem, including the ones that we're dealing with right now. From this perspective, decision-making around COVID in our institutions should be simultaneously reality-based. In other words, this tradition looks at what the best of reason can give us, attentive and responsive to the truth of what's going on, to how things work, and to how people work. And at the same time, value-oriented, devoted to and organized and executed in ways that respect the dignity and enhance the well-being of all our different stakeholders and the whole community of stakeholders. But we know this is not easy, as Patrick well put it at the beginning. This tradition also affirms that we live in a broken world, a world that's limited by finitude, the fact that we're fallible, the fact that we can't see the future. And on the other hand, it's crushed by sin or injustice, which creates a situation which we can be sure that any instantiation of our principles will be partial and will be flawed. And yet we have to move forward. As we think about life and livelihood, two broader principles are key. Catholic social thought, as this discussion has continued over the last 100 years and the last several decades, has increasingly focused on a path to address systemic problematic situations, structures of sin, structures of injustice, and that path has been called solidarity. Understood in a particular way, we are all interdependent. COVID has brought that home ridiculously clearly. We can't help but be interdependent. So solidarity is recognizing that fact of interdependence, taking moral responsibility for that fact, and then acting accordingly toward the common good, not just the individual good. This is different than our American society that tends to think in terms of individual goods. We as Catholic institutions are committed to a tradition that thinks in terms of the reverence for each person within a complex common good, and that means we all owe things to the community as well as are entitled to things, particularly those of us who have more power, more privilege, more resources. So a CST-infused way of proceeding for Catholic higher education, I think, will put these reopening decisions in a larger moral and even spiritual context that highlights the dignity and rights of all people and stakeholders, particularly focusing on flipping the pyramid of who we listen to most carefully usually. We listen to the people with most money, with most power, with most voice. Flip the pyramid to say, how do we put on a pair of glasses that asks that question from the other side as much as we can? And the dignity and rights within this common good, being aware and humble about our incorrigible finitude and what we don't know. And we're going to make mistakes in our actual entanglement in systemic sin and justice. These were givens before COVID, and they're front and center now.
Professor Spirahinzi, thank you. Oops, sorry, I didn't.
You didn't warn me. Okay, I'll stop. I have more to say, obviously, but I'll stop.
Professor Spirahinzi, thanks for getting us going so well. I'm going to hand the floor to Professor Beyer now.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Patrick. Is everyone hearing me correct? Okay. So thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today. I know that these are incredibly hectic and busy times for all of us. I imagine many of us are feeling burnout, exhausted, and overwhelmed by the enormity of the problems that we face, as Patrick rightly pointed out in his introductory remarks. And with that, I want to begin by saying, or kind of confess what I might call epistemological poverty to a degree, because I understand that my positions on these issues are limited by my own perspective, my own ability to see as I see, given my own predilections, biases, which we all bring to reality. When we look at reality, we all have our own biases, as Hans-Georg Gadamer discussed in his great work, Truth and Method. Now, with that, I would also add, I have spent the last 10 years of my career thinking about and writing about higher education from the perspective of Catholic social teaching. That does not mean I have all the answers to these problems by any stretch. I do think it means that I'm more engaged in these issues than the average professor academic in the academy, even if I'm not an administrator or board of trustees member. One of our great mentors at Boston College, James Keenan, in his book, University Ethics, writes about how a lot of professors remain siloed in their own areas of work, and therefore removed from the workings of, the difficult workings of a university. I've chosen not to do that. I've been engaged in various ways in the life of my university and other universities. So with that, I want to move to some of the themes actually that Christine had spoken about and amplify them, and then move into some particularities of the current situation. For starters, I want to speak about human dignity and the sanctity of life. Another mentor of mine, the renowned Jesuit theologian David Hollenbach, wrote about human dignity in Catholic social teaching, and how Catholic social teaching over time throughout its historical development looked at the conditions, historical, economic, social conditions of a given era, and tried to discern what is required in those conditions to protect and promote human dignity. So we are obviously in a crucible right now where we're forced to confront what is it that is necessary to protect human dignity in this moment, which has brought some obvious new problems to us. The first thing I would say about that is that, and this has been the case throughout the history of modern Catholic social teaching, we need to look to the disciplines outside of Catholic theology, such as sociology, the biological sciences, economics, any and all disciplines that can help us discern what is necessary to promote human and protect human dignity right now. Therefore, I would say the first thing that anyone trying to grapple with this question right now about how to promote human dignity and the sanctity of life, the sacredness of life, protect the sacredness of life, is that decisions need to be guided by the best available science. One of the beautiful things, in my view, about the Catholic tradition is that Catholicism doesn't see conflict between faith and science. Catholicism promotes, holds that there is, that science and that faith are ultimately aiming at the same reality. In other words, trying to discern what it is to help protect God's children and to promote and help build the kingdom of God. So John Paul II beautifully spoke about this in a letter that he wrote to scientists with regard to the need to incorporate science into our ethical thinking. And so that would be the first point I would raise. What is the best available science saying? I don't pretend to have all the answers about that, but I do want to say that there are some scientists, epidemiologists, who are saying that reopening campuses robustly would be to put people in harm's way, to actually bring about a grave risk and grave harm in terms of loss of life. You may know there was a Washington Post op-ed just a week ago in this regard by 3 public health infectious disease experts at Georgetown University, cautioning that the risk is too high to robustly open campus. The risk with regard to serious health consequences for many individuals and death. There may be other perspectives from other epidemiologists, but the point I'm making really is that we need to first look to those perspectives. We cannot engage in what a colleague of mine called magical thinking about this. The next point I want to raise is with regard to the right to participation in Catholic social teaching. And I've written about this if anyone is interested in this to a greater degree. Participation, the right to participation, which is affirmed by Catholic social teaching, holds that individuals and communities have a right to participate in those decisions that will have a dramatic effect on their lives. And so students, faculty, and staff, in one way or another, have a right to participate in the conversations going on their campuses right now. I see that time is beginning to run short for me, so I want to move now to the common good. First and foremost, what needs to be said from the standpoint of Catholic social teaching is common good thinking is very different than utilitarianism. The common good in the Catholic social tradition does not hold that we should think about what would be the greatest good for the greatest number. Rather, it's about thinking about what conditions are necessary for all human beings to flourish, in a nutshell. So in that regard, I would caution us to think about how our actions may or may not contribute to a public health crisis for the larger community in the decisions that we make. Universities, colleges and universities are part of a larger ecosystem, and they need to see themselves in this vein. They're part of a larger moral landscape that must be taken into account. I'm going to stop there, but I know we have time for question and answer. So perhaps if there's something that I said that piqued someone's curiosity, I'd be happy to answer a question along those lines.
Professor Beyer, thank you so much. Before I hand it over to Professor Ford, I see some of our attendees have already begun using the Q&A function. For those of you who came in late, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can see each other's questions, and you can upvote questions that you'd really like to see our panelists talk about. So it's never too early. Professor Ford.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining, and thank you, Professor Hornbeck and Professor Fiorenze at Fordham for inviting me to this panel. When I think about ethics, I think about stories and the stories of the people that we're going to be interacting with. And the beginning of the story for me as an ethicist is, what is the scene? What is the stage on which we are acting? And I see, when I think about COVID-19 and Catholic universities, I see two major constraints. One is that for many of our institutions, we have to reopen in some way or risk financial collapse or devastation. And I think that's just one of the realest ways to represent where we're at right now. Particularly smaller institutions will not be able to survive if there is not some way in which they can reopen. So I recognize that as a constraint under which we're operating. And I think that's important to acknowledge. And the second constraint I see is that I think for better, we in the United States are being relieved of our consensual hallucination that this pandemic is going to end at any time soon. I think it's quite clear that by where an American passport can travel, just in the last week, the world has told us that we are not managing this pandemic well and that we're going to be stuck in this for a very long time, especially given the leadership that we have and just the way we are ourselves responding to the need to enact best practices around social distancing, wearing masks, et cetera. So with those two constraints in mind, I think the question is not so much, let's find an ideal solution. There is no ideal solution. Going to school in a pandemic, doing anything in a pandemic is risky. There's going to be costs that we all have to take into account. But the question that is strong in my mind is, how do we operate the best and virtuously under the constraints that we're given? And I think we can only do that well if we tell as many of the stories of people who are in our communities as possible, and then see how we can take responsibility for that in the face of collective risk in the middle of these two very deep and very real constraints that we have. So I think, for example, of course, of what it means now for me as a faculty member. So in the spring, I was kind of just hidden away in my office, or well, this is my office now, my apartment, and I just taught here. No one had to see me. And then in the fall, now I am entering essentially the front lines of this pandemic, meeting with people who are going wherever. And I think that's also just very real, right? Our students are going to come back to campus, and we hope that they're going to follow the best guidelines, but also we know that they're people, and that people do sometimes skirt the rules and skirt best practices, particularly when they're so young, right, at 18, 19, right? So there's a question about, for me, who is now being placed in this vulnerable positions. And I think that's something we really have to keep in mind, right? We're all vulnerable because of COVID-19, but what practices are we doing as an institution when we are asking people to be placed into vulnerable positions, right? And in the university, there are even inequalities in that vulnerability. As a faculty member, I'm asked, for example, do you want to teach fully online? If so, apply for an exemption, right? But I think about, for example, my staff colleagues, right? Think about people living in residence life, right? I have not seen yet many people in residence life getting asked if they would like to sit and live with college students in their dorms, right? That's a justice issue for us, right? And it's a privilege issue for those of us who teach. To recognize that, right? Calling out people who are made vulnerable because our institutions have to reopen, right? It is faculty, it is staff, right? And it is students too who are living in these situations. But I also think particularly about Black students, students of color, right? If we look at how racial disparities exist in our countries and in our institutions, what we're faced with is recognizing that if we pull people into our institutions, but then end up sending them home because maybe in 4 or 5 weeks we have outbreaks, right? How are we going to continue to learn? How are they vulnerable again, right? Are they more vulnerable when they go home to the jobs that they have? How are we providing for our students, for example, educational materials if they don't have access to the internet? Are we thinking about those sorts of vulnerabilities, right? And I also think about our LGBT folks as well, right? Where coming to campus might be good for them in some way, but then going home, right, could be dangerous for them again. How do we take responsibility as institutions, recognizing all these variables in people's lives? And so I think it moves us, to really thinking about solidarity and trying to think through how we live together and hold this risk together. And I think it involves some really big truth telling. One of those truths that we need to tell is, what's the mission of Catholic education right now? Is the mission of our institutions, how are we as institutions supporting, as Jerry was talking about, right, the dignity of every person, right? If we know that we're in financially precarious positions, how are we ensuring that we don't end up firing or letting go of people who are most vulnerable when we get sent home, if we get sent home again? Whose jobs are going to be lost? Are Black and brown people again going to be devastated by this? How do we make decisions as institutions that say, we know this is coming? We know that everyone is going to be in a double jeopardy. So how do we make decisions financially and otherwise that allow us to keep all of our communities together while we weather the storm? So I'll stop there for now. But really my mind is focused on those two things. One is solidarity, right? How do we weather this together? But how do we weather this together, recognizing that our various stories present us with different types of vulnerability, and we need to be aware of all of them as we think about reopening. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Ford, and thanks to those of you who are sending in comments and questions. Let me turn to Professor Ward, and then we'll begin to open up the conversation.
Thank you, and I'm glad to be here with my friends and colleagues, and really honored that all of you took the time to come listen to us. A key principle of Catholic social thought is that we as humans have moral agency. Obviously, we have different menus of choices depending on where we find ourselves in life, but we're still able to act within our different situations and responsible for what we do. We're never so constrained by circumstances that we lose our responsibility to care for others and do what is right. But it's also true that acting within impossible circumstances, such as a global pandemic, takes its toll on people as moral actors. Theologians have learned a lot about this thanks to veterans and professionals who work with them. Some doctors with the VA coined the term moral injury, and we use it in theology to talk about how acting in impossible circumstances can injure our sense of ourself as moral and good. We all want to see ourselves as good people. But some of us veterans and others have done things we perceive to be deeply morally wrong. If you, for example, did something that caused another person's death, you may have been in a situation where it seemed justified. That may have been part of your role. You may even have been under direct orders from someone above you. But at the end of the day, you are the one who did that thing and caused that death. Maybe there didn't seem to be a choice, but often we can't square the wrong that was done with the image of ourselves as good. So there can be two possible outcomes, equally unfortunate. The first is moral injury, and that's when people become so consumed by the harm they have done that they can no longer see themselves as good or even capable of redemption. And this is obviously quite damaging to mental health. The other danger is that in order to maintain the image of ourselves as good, we retroactively justify the harmful action. We ignore the opportunity to make amends or to struggle to change the harmful system that shaped our choices. From the perspective of Catholic social thought, we're always capable of redemption. And one important path to that is repenting for harms done and working to build a more just world in which we'll make our choices in the future. This work of rebuilding the world is not only morally important, doctors have found it to be clinically helpful in addressing moral injury. So I hope you don't think I'm being over the top by using the example of causing death. As Jerry said, indeed, we're in a situation in which we're discussing matters of life and death, and there seem to be no good choices. If we open up, some people will get sick and some will die. If we don't open campus, as Craig said, some students will be home in less than safe situations. Some may come to harm there, others may not finish their degree, and other harms may occur, instability to our institutions, job loss of vulnerable workers. I know we have many university decision makers in this room, and I don't envy your position of being the one to make the call. Making choices under such hard constraints absolutely exposes you to moral injury. At the same time, many members of our universities are facing their own impossible choices. Perhaps they have vulnerable family members, but feel they have no choice financially, but coming into work. So all each of us can do is try to do the right thing with the choices available to us. I want us all to think ahead to a day when, God willing, this pandemic is behind us. Despite our best and even most heroic efforts during these times, when it's over, we will have lost people who are with us now. Our institutions will be changed, and each of us will be changed by the choices we've made during these days. The only way I can imagine responding appropriately is through lament. Fordham's own Brian Massengale describes lament as telling the truth in response to suffering, refusing to look away. He writes, "Laments name the pain present, and they forthrightly acknowledge that life and relationships have gone terribly wrong. Lament can be a language to express our own suffering and grief, or to repent for suffering we've caused to others. Lament is a form of truth-telling and contrition that acknowledges both the harms that have been done to others and one's own personal and communal culpability for them," Massengale says, "and laments honestly, forthrightly, even brutally recognize wrenching circumstances, yet proclaim that in the midst of the pain, there is another word to be heard from God, a message of compassion and deliverance." I think all Catholic colleges should plan when this is over for a year of lamentation. On our own campuses and together as Catholic colleges and universities, we'll need to name and grieve the harms that were done and could have been avoided, the lives lost and the human potential that was thwarted, and looking inward, we'll need to lament the moral injury to the decision makers and to all those caught in impossible situations. And Massengale says that lament invites us to change. This time of naming and grieving loss will be a time to ask ourselves what we could have done differently as people and institutions, and how to be prepared the next time the unimaginable comes to our door. So the first place to turn will be to these Catholic principles: solidarity, as Christine said, flipping the pyramid, protection of life, and concern for the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Professor Ward, thank you so very much. And thanks to all of our panelists for putting so many issues on the table. You'll see in both the chat and the Q&A that there are lots of questions that have already come in. I will do my very best to moderate and to facilitate getting through as many issues as possible. And in that spirit, I hope that the questioners won't mind when sometimes we combine questions that are more similar to each other. At the very beginning of this panel, I named what I think we all recognize as the twin crises operative in this moment: the pandemic and structural racism, particularly anti-Black racism. And a number of the questioners touch on that intersection. So let me just read to the panel 2 of the questions, and then open it up for one or more of you to respond. First, a colleague from St. John's University in Queens writes, I will be teaching online in the fall semester. How will the structure of sin of racism be addressed in all our universities and colleges going forward? To me, this is more urgent and necessary than even how we open. And another colleague asks, apart from the church itself, do white Catholics have enough faith and hope to change? Any member of the panel like to begin that conversation? Christine, and then Kate, and then Craig.
Thank you for those questions. They're in the forefront of the kinds of things I've been thinking about with respect to a Catholic social approach to what we're doing with our universities in the coming year. It's definitely true, as Patrick said, and Craig also echoed, that we are approaching COVID with the intersection of racial injustice squarely at the crux of the matter, and the need for our universities, which for the most part are predominantly white institutions, to redouble and recommit and maybe newly commit ourselves to the work of anti-racism. And so I really appreciate the colleague at St. John's and the other person raising that question. What is incumbent on us as predominantly white institutions to keep in mind as we make the decisions Craig was talking about under constraint? Which communities are going to be hit the hardest by the decisions that are going to be made? That's a larger question for the university, but we as teachers have an obligation in each of our classrooms to be finding space to speak and to help our students study and understand and converse about these intersections and how we create the capabilities among ourselves institutionally and personally to step up more than we have in solidarity to face the racial issues as well as the economic issues, again, which are intertwined with the public health issues.
Professor Ward.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think the way you framed your question in terms of faith and hope is crucial, because I think if we're going to deal with systemic racism, it has to be through faith. It's not a rational problem. It's not one that we can reason away. The material on lament that I quoted from Brian Massengale is from his book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, where he explains that racism is a spiritual problem that needs spiritual solutions. So in a way, I think our Catholic institutions are crucial in handling this, right? If the church is going to do this work, Catholic colleges and universities will have a crucial role to play. And another thing that's been on my mind in our response to COVID-19 is how in anti-racist work, we're taught that speed is a value of majority white culture, right? Getting things done quickly and to deadline. Silences marginalized voices and can be a really effective tactic and tool for doing that. So I hope our Catholic institutions will think about how and when we slam on the brakes when what these genuinely life and death decisions are being made, to say, where are the marginalized voices? Where are the marginalized lives? How can we value these precious lives, even when it feels so urgent to be quick and fast?
Let me invite Professor Ford in, and then we'll move on to another topic.
Yeah, I think this summer is really an important moment for us as staff and faculty and administrators in Catholic higher education to recognize that there is a lot of work to be done. There is this lethargy in the summer that we faculty have. We don't like to be contacted, and white faculty have got a lot of work to do, right? There are two big projects that have to go on simultaneously. One is that we all have to get our courses, everyone has to get their courses ready to do some version of hybrid and potentially even go back to a fully online version. That's one piece of work that has to get done. But two, we need to evaluate all of our syllabi, all of our programming, to see how we are committed to an anti-racist mission, right? And that means that we have to do that work of reassessing what our course objectives are. how are we actually incorporating this commitment to anti-racism into what we're teaching, regardless of what discipline we happen to be in, right? And that's on the academic affairs side, but also on the student affairs side. This is a moment where we have to frame this for our students to help them see what's going on. And that's not going to take place without significant work. There's a lot of work that needs to be done by white professors to really get into the mode of adopting an anti-racist stance. We owe that to Black and brown and other white students, right, who come to us from wherever they're coming. And I think that's something that we have to recognize. It's going to take a lot of work. This is not something that we can do simply by picking up one book and hoping for the best, right? Robin DiAngelo is great. All of these people are great. Reading Ibram Kendi is great. But unless we get to the how am I going to hold myself and my students accountable, we will waste the moment that we've been put in by looking at by observing these uprisings, right? We will waste the moment if we don't do the work.
Thanks. Professor Beyer.
I'll be brief on this, even though I have a lot to say. I have a chapter in my forthcoming book on racial equity on campus, but in the interest of time, I'm going to limit myself to one comment. It's time for us to move beyond platitudes with regard to racial equity on campus. It's time for us not to simply say Black Lives Matter, but to act as if they do. And one suggestion that I have is that we look at our decision makers. Who's at the table when these decisions are being made at the highest levels? So starting with boards of trustees, which are predominantly white, predominantly male, at institutions across the university, who's at the table when these decisions are being made is crucial.
Thanks, Professor Beyer. And that actually leads us well into another set of questions, the ones that our 201 attendees have been upvoting the most. I think that these fall broadly under the category of equity and care for vulnerable persons. So let me just read two of them to the panel. And I'll turn to Dr. Ford first. One colleague asks, legal counsel in a webinar warned about the need for equity and who works from campus and who does not. The example that was given was not showing bias against a single childless staff member by requiring them to report to campus while a parent of a young child is allowed to work from home. How do you suggest we balance such advice with care for the vulnerable, including children, the importance of family life and other ethical considerations? And another colleague asks, the Catholic understanding of the common good requires special attention to the least powerful and most vulnerable members of our society. National attention to COVID has not done this, with terrible consequences for so-called essential workers, many of whom fall into this powerless group. How does a preferential option for the powerless play into our decisions about reopening? Professor Ford.
I think, to be completely frank, it means how do we keep people as healthy as possible and as employed as possible, recognizing that there are great disparities in income in a university context, right? If we know that we can expect reliable leadership to get this curve down, then we as Catholics have to ask, how do we hold on to all the people that we've got, right? And that means calling up the magic accountants who do the numbers that I'm not smart enough to handle to say, how do we keep everyone employed for the next 12 months, right? And who might be making so much money that they might have to go without in order for that to happen. I think there's only so much money in the institution, but we do have to look at some of these disparities in income and ask ourselves, right? Yes, people are taking pay cuts, right? But if we really want to keep everyone here, how do we make that happen? And that's something that we have to think about if we know that the money that we have coming in is not going to be as high as it has been in the past. Healthy as possible. You know, I think it's hard to, like I said, we all are vulnerable to this virus in some way, and trying to find a fair way for people to assume risk is going to be difficult. I think one of the ways that people have tried to do that, one of the ways that I've seen in the news, at least people trying to do that, is to say, we'll pay you more if you assume more risk. I don't know if that's the most just way to go about this, but I know that's one way that people have thought about doing it. I think another way might be to recognize that if we want to keep people employed, maybe we have to ask our students who might be receiving these services, are they willing to accept that person, these people won't be able to come to campus. Like, trust our students as moral agents and part of our communities, and tell them, listen, we've got faculty and staff all over the place who are living with all these vulnerabilities. We want you to come back to campus, but we also have to keep these people safe. Are there things that you're willing to sacrifice so that way we can keep this mission going? You know, I think we talk to our students as if they're customers and only just do satisfaction maximization. But I also think they also know they're living in a pandemic as well. Can we ask them questions that actually ask them to think about what they might be willing to do for the common good? And that would be an education in social justice that we could do it as Catholic universities.
Professor Ford, you've raised the important issue of health, and there are other questions in the chat about that. But before I turn, would any of the other panelists like to join in on this set of questions about equity and vulnerable members of our communities? Professor Beyer. Sorry, you're muted.
I thought I had hit the button, sorry. I do think in our decision-making, for starters, we have to account for the fact that Black, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples are 5 times more likely to die from COVID-19 if they contract it. That's what the science tells us. So I think that would be the point of departure to take that, to really absorb that fact. Moving from there, and again, these are prudential judgments about how to move from there, how to apply the principles of Catholic social teaching to a fact like that, to an empirical reality. As Craig mentioned, what do we do to help people retain their jobs? Vulnerable populations retain their jobs. On that score, I would just add to what Dr. Ford said. Again, transparency is key. I think we need to have open, frank conversations about shared sacrifice. But in order to do that, it really does require having open, transparent conversations about endowments, what truly can be done and cannot be done with endowments, and about salaries, in order to be able to ask all people, and I would include myself in this, to make shared sacrifice to protect the most vulnerable. Again, on the front of keeping people healthy, if we're asking people from vulnerable populations to come back to campus, or even in some cases requiring them, then are we doing everything in our power to ensure their safety? There's no panacea in that regard, but PPE. Are we heavily investing in the PPE, plexiglass, shields, face shields, N95s, anything else that the best science is telling us that we can provide in order to protect those who will have to come back to campus?
Professor Ward.
Yeah, thank you. I really like the tension that Craig brought up. That's are we, we're concerned with livelihood. We want to keep people employed, but are we stuck in assuming that the best we can offer people is a job in which they risk their life, right? Are there more creative ways to envision this? That's the national conversation, right? The economy or life. Can Catholic universities think more creatively? And I really like the suggestion about not assuming that our students are selfish and our customers, because in my experience, they're not at all. So we talk about shared sacrifice in terms of salaries, in terms of budgets. What about asking maybe our more advanced students, okay, you know the lay of the land, could you take more classes online so our first years can come to campus and get their footing, if that's what we're trying to do? I think treating them as members of a community, which they absolutely are, and in my experience, I think they'd be very receptive to that.
Thanks so much. I'm going to do a sort of academic jujitsu in combining a few of the next questions. I think they broadly fall into the category of holistic well-being and health, mental health, as well as physical health. One question that's attracted a number of comments is about student mental health, which, as we know, even before the pandemic, was a major challenge for college students of all ages, but maybe particularly for traditional age college students. One questioner notes, college students regularly report that being together with their peers is critical to their mental health and development. Being online only in the fall may well exacerbate depression and perhaps even suicide rates. Yikes. How does our care for student mental health inform decisions about coming back together in the fall? And then another set of comments speaks to the health issue from another angle. Colleague writes, I've been spending a lot of time considering the implementation of plans to keep the campus community safe. It seems that the only way to open ethically is to have plans and mitigation strategies that are actually implemented, which means enforced. The flip side of this is the danger of policing our campuses. And as we know, the uprising in response to George Floyd's death have once again brought forward a broader recognition of the harms that such an approach has to our Black, Indigenous, and people of color community members. I'd be interested in hearing thoughts and reflections on this tension from the panelists. So I'll start with Professor Fiora-Hinze, and I know others of you may wish to jump in as well.
There's a lot in that question. Let me start by talking about the mental health question. Working on people's health vulnerabilities is, again, a constant at any Catholic university, any university or college. This is exacerbated and deepened in the current context. But one thing that strikes me from the CST perspective is something that's been just mentioned a couple of minutes ago by Drs. Ward and Ford, which is when people feel like they are being seen and included in a community, whether they're physically there or not, whether they're on campus or not, and when people are being appealed to in their agency, that they can make decisions and do things that can make a difference. The literature shows us that this is always good for a community and for the individual's mental health. I think sense of powerlessness, a sense of the unknown, a sense of isolation, as was said in the question, these are problems for everybody in the university community, including our students. And so a leadership stance that invites all stakeholders in, all voices in, especially the most, again, flip the pyramid, who are the most vulnerable, including people including our students, and ask them what they're willing to do. And also speaks to the fact that we're all being asked and invited to decide to take a pay cut, in my case, for example. I think, Jerry, you call them solidarity pay cuts in your book. That if we can get a transparent communication to our larger communities about this is what we need to do, this is what we need to hold, these are our priorities, what can you do? Here are some suggestions. Can you do this? Are you willing to take an online class from a professor who has 3 little kids at home, or whatever it might be? I think that could be very energizing and good for mental health. I'll just stop there.
Professor Beyer, I know you previously talked about participation. We have some comments from students who are here with us today in the chat talking about the social pressure that students might feel from one another and the collective trauma experience that students have coming back to campus. I'll let you build on Professor Fiora-Hinze's comments.
Thank you. Just to add to what Christine said, mental health, and I would add spiritual health on Catholic campuses these are crucial issues. And certainly at the heart of what we at least say we're trying to do, and I believe we are trying to do for the most part, which is educate the whole person and promote the growth of whole people and communities. And so we have to take a look at what's been going on with university health centers and the woefully perhaps understaffed, underfunded university health centers. There was an article in the Washington Post about this, or rather, it was an eye-opening article. I'll leave it at that. What about mental health centers, counseling centers on our campuses? So many of those are understaffed. So if we decide, and that's an if I'm stating, if we decide that most students are not going to be allowed to return to campus, as some colleges have, can we provide counseling via video conferencing? It can be done. Can we ensure that our counseling center staff are employed to be able to do that, first of all? Can we ensure that our campus ministers are employed and trained to do that from the tech side? So that would be one point that I would, or a couple of points that I would add.
Thanks so much. I want to turn to a slightly different but still related topic, which has to do with solidarity. One of the key features of Catholic social teaching, and something I know a number of our panelists have already addressed. And at least three different forms of solidarity have been named in the Q&A. First, one colleague writes, this crisis is putting a huge financial pressure on smaller Catholic colleges in particular. These are often colleges serving first-generation students who are especially at risk. Some worry that if they can't reopen, the colleges will not survive. Many of them were already under pressure. It's very likely some may close for good. Do larger universities, such as those, say, represented by some of the members on this panel, have any responsibility in this moment to the smaller institutions? What about solidarity across Catholic higher ed? Another questioner asked about solidarity with adjunct and part-time faculty, noting that there are levels of vulnerability at play for those colleagues that differ for tenure-track colleagues. And yet another colleague raises a question about solidarity with regard to those who are parenting in the midst of the pandemic, noting that in San Diego, just like Los Angeles yesterday, it was announced that public elementary schools are not reopening at all in the fall. This person's university employs many parents whose children will be learning remotely. There's a variety of forms of solidarity at stake. Professor Ford, let me turn first to you and then see who else on the panel would like to join in.
Yeah, there's so much in the question of what does solidarity as Catholic institutions mean? The one theme that comes to my mind when I think about this is that we have to be animated by a sense of abundance, that we are always on the brink of abundance. One of the things that we hear Jesus teach us is that there can be 2 loaves and a fish and you can feed 5,000 people. I wonder what that means for us as Catholic institutions, right? What does it mean to see ourselves not as competing for students, but cooperating with students at a regional level to deliver this educational product? What does that mean creatively to do that? Does that mean saying that we're not going to engage in this practice that we all know is secretly competitive, but we say it because we want those students, right? That's one thing on the table, right? Does it mean that we offer our students the opportunity to take classes online at another institution? I think reciprocity in some ways can be easier in this digital environment because it's so easy to invite people into spaces without having to move from their chairs, right? So thinking creatively around cooperation instead of competition, I think, is the direction that we need to go to think through that.
Thanks. Professor Fiorahinzi.
Yes, just echoing that, I think an ethic of solidarity coming from the Catholic social tradition is one in which there's a willingness for equitable sacrifice and also a willingness to think about, Craig talked about abundance. I like that, on the brink of abundance, because there's a spirituality under this, a spirituality and a stance that is not clenched and closed in and all looking only at our own good. And let's face it, we are in a situation where people are afraid. They're afraid for their personal bodily survival, and they're afraid for their institutional survival. This is a recipe for non-solidarity. This is a recipe for like circling the wagons, clenching in your hearts and hands and minds and saying, we just got to take care of our own here. And even that we don't know how to do, right? But it's also an opportunity. A crisis is an opportunity to look at exactly what Dr. Ford talked about. How do we proceed if we're different? If we claim we're different, that we're doing something different here as Catholic universities, how do we proceed out of our tradition in a way that looks at collaboration? Resources that may not even cost us financially that much, which is where the digital thing may come in. But it takes a very strong decision not to operate out of fear and not to simply turn inward more than we usually do. I've been on boards of trustees discussions where the idea of our Jesuit schools cooperating or maybe giving funds to one another was dismissed because it's illegal. That the board has fiduciary responsibility for our school, and so we can't give money to that school. So there's many layers of resistance here, but how do we create a culture in our schools that starts to actually take seriously these touch points, these values that we want to say we have? And so then cultivating a sense of what is sufficiency. Do we have enough? Is it sufficient if some classes are online? Is it sufficient if I take this much of a pay cut and so forth? That takes an underlying ethical and spiritual stance that I think is crucial to talk about on our campuses.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give all of our panelists, as we come into this last quarter hour of this session, an absolutely impossible assignment. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to try to summarize a number of the questions remaining in the Q&A. Unfortunately, as predicted, there were so many, we aren't going to be able to get to every last one of them. But let me name a few themes and topics that have come up, and then we'll go back around in the order that we began with, if that'll be all right for our panelists, to speak about any of these topics or any other closing thoughts that you might have for 2 or 3 minutes apiece. A number of our questioners are asking about how to balance, in Professor Fiora-Hinze's words, lives with livelihood. How do we think about balancing all of the different harms, all of the different goods that are at stake? One questioner refers to the CST principles and maybe even the virtues that we might appeal to in making those sorts of determinations. Other questioners are asking about how faculty in particular might be in a position to teach best in these particular circumstances. Is mask-to-mask teaching, a phrase we've adopted in lieu of face-to-face teaching, always necessarily better than technologically mediated teaching or not? How do we think about that? How do we think about questions involving retention, particularly of vulnerable students who, as we know, as one commenter points out, even one bad semester may severely hamper their ability to complete college? Then last of all, there are some very large, very overarching questions. How do we live out the distinctive mission of Catholic higher education and the different sort of sub-charisms, whether that be Lasallian or Jesuit or Dominican higher education, in this particular moment? So with all that as fodder, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to take 2 to 3 minutes to address whichever of those points most move them at this time. Professor Fiora-Hinze.
One thing that strikes me out of that bouquet of questions is this question about how do people teach best? How do we help students if, say, we're in student affairs? How do we help our vulnerable, economically vulnerable? One thing about the CST perspective is this strong emphasis on solidarity, but also what's called subsidiarity. And that's the idea that within a unit, like let's say a university or college, there are different parts, different groups doing different things, different departments. And subsidiarity is about trusting and empowering people who are doing their jobs in different areas to do their jobs. And so the people who know best how to help the struggling, financially struggling, first generation student are probably the people who work with those students. The faculty know the best how to figure out how to teach a class in an unusual circumstance. And part of what's, again, I think morale building and energizing can be to tell people on our campuses, you already know your job. We trust you to do it. How can you be creative to help in this crisis situation? So that's one thing, the idea of empowering people or communicating our trust in each other to do our jobs and to do them well. In addition, I want to just say something I couldn't at the beginning, which is we're dealing with a question, we're dealing in an emergency situation with issues of risk. And one of the things, again, about risk is we tend to be selfish. We tend to think of ourselves as homo economicus. We have to think about the money and so forth. And we want to protect our flanks against liability and so forth. But the CST position encourages us to at least unclench our fingers a little bit as we approach these issues. The last thing, though, I'll say is about risk is if we're talking about life and livelihood, how do we factor in genuine uncertainty? That's different than risk. We are in a situation now where we really don't know. And that creates another set of moral dilemmas that Kate was referring to earlier in terms of the fact that we still have to act when we really don't know. And that's not risk, that's just uncertainty. And that is what we're all dealing with. And just to be honest about it with each other and to say we're doing the best we can, but we really don't know. And we need to be patient with each other and forgiving of ourselves and others, because it's going to be messy no matter what.
Going to be messy no matter what. Right. Professor Beyer.
Well, there's so much to say and so little time to say it. I'm going to just pick up on a couple of important questions that were raised. To start, the question of mission, and I'm going to link it to what I and others call moral formation. So in this moment, of course, Catholic higher education is tasked with, as a part of its mission, moral formation. That's what we're called to do as educators in a Catholic institution. So in this moment, what does that mean? What does that look like? What I called in my essay, the pedagogical moment. And so this relates to some things that I think Craig had said, if I recall earlier. There's a lot of talk right now about students wanting to be on campus because they're yearning for the campus experience. What does that mean? Asking ourselves, what does that really mean? And in this moment, having a hard look at this, both as individuals and as a community. What does it mean to want a campus experience? And trying to discern whether when we say that, there's lots of data out there that says the vast majority of students want to return to campus. And that fair enough, and we should certainly take that into account. But encouraging students to think about what that really means. Are they thinking about learning outcomes? Or are they thinking about some other elements of that campus experience when they answer a question like that? Are they thinking about their obligations to the larger community when they answer a question like that? I think that's imperative for us, or that's one of the imperatives of many imperatives that we're facing. I also want to return to the question of solidarity with adjuncts. I've done a lot of work around this, as some of you know, and so I really want to answer that question, which was asked earlier. Some campuses have, and we've touched on this briefly, allowed faculty to apply for workplace accommodations or exemptions, as Craig called them. And I think it's really crucial for us to ensure that whatever processes are adopted on our campuses, whatever decisions are made in those regards, that adjunct faculty are not disadvantaged in those processes. Adjunct faculty, if we're being honest with ourselves, oftentimes, though not always, are not in a place, they are vulnerable. They're not in a place to speak out for themselves or speak up for themselves as those of us who are blessed with a tenure track position are. So we need to make sure that there's fairness and equity in those processes and those decisions. And those of us who are on tenure, I refer in my book to tenure track privilege. Those of us who have the privilege of tenure or tenure track jobs need to, at this time more than ever, to reach out to our adjunct colleagues, make sure they're involved in this process, make sure they have agency and voice as much as possible from that place of vulnerability. What can we do to help them in solidarity in this moment?
And that's such a great way of combining those virtues you talked about before, solidarity and participation. Thanks very much. Professor Ford.
Yeah, I think what the constellation of questions raises in my mind is the need for us to think out of a growth mindset, right? Last semester, we all got thrown online within weeks, which for faculties which think in terms of semesters, if not longer, was like the equivalent of a slap in the face, maybe 2 or 3 slaps in the face at once, right? And so what that means for me is that there is, yes, teaching online is not like teaching face-to-face, but that means there are new opportunities that I've had teaching online that I haven't had. And so what does it mean now to generate content all the time, right? I'm generating videos all the time. I'm collaborating with colleagues across the country all the time now, right? What does it mean to rethink what a lot of our students want, which is they want to get a job after college. So why don't I reach out to employers and see if they want to come into my class and talk about something around social justice, right? Give students possibilities and futures that they wouldn't have had if we were sitting mask to mask or in these brick and mortar settings, right? How do I think about, how do we think as an institution around this ballooning cost of higher education? What can we do as Catholics to keep our education accessible to people, right? And I think that's something, those are 3 things, right? How do we use this moment as an opportunity to grow, to not engage in a deficit mindset, but to something that can lead us to a new horizon, a new way of doing things that we might not have thought before. But thank God that we have the opportunity to think through it, even as we are operating under these unprecedented constraints.
Thanks. And then over to Professor Ward for the final word from our panel.
Thank you. I want to re-amplify what Dr. Firahinzi said about appealing to people in their agency. I've been spending a lot of this pandemic romanticizing in my mind the period of the US in World War II when, in my mind, everybody had a role to play and people did their victory gardens, and school children in Wisconsin, as I recently learned, collected milkweed fluff for life jackets, millions and millions of pounds. And I've been struggling with how can we reclaim that sense of feeling connected and like everyone has something to contribute. But then I look at the protests, right? And I see that we haven't lost that sense at all, that others' lives matter to me, their safety and health and flourishing is bound up with mine. So we haven't lost that sense. What we need are leaders who can direct the goodness in people, and they're wanting to use their agency to keeping each other safe, to making sure institutions will still be here when this is all over. And I hope that our Catholic institutions and their leaders can do that. If we can't, I'm not sure we deserve to be around when this is still over. The NCR today reported that how the University of Dayton, led by the board, not by students, was able to maintain their fiduciary responsibilities and divest from fossil fuels, which they saw as really core to their mission. So I think what we keep trying to say is it doesn't need to be lives or the survival of the institution, right? But it takes creative work. But I think that that sense of abundance and hope that Craig is trying to point us toward, I think that we can find it if we work together.
Professor Ward, thank you very much, and so many thanks to all our panelists. I'll try in these last 2 minutes to sum up a few themes that I think we heard throughout this really, really fantastic conversation. And those themes so often include things like approaching the challenges, the wicked problems that are in front of us with a mindset of abundance, the mutual solidarity that people have been talking about. I know one book that's been really influential for my thinking in this is by Kathleen Fitzpatrick. It's called Generous Thinking, A Radical Approach to Saving the University. It's not a book that comes definitively out of the Catholic social teaching framework, but so often, as a number of us have pointed out, when the mindset is about how do I protect my turf, it ends up pitting groups of individuals in the university, tenure-line faculty, part-time faculty, students, administrators, donors, etc., against each other, rather than recognizing that we are all part of a flourishing and a common good. And I think what all of our panelists in all of their different ways this afternoon have highlighted is that if Catholic higher education is to be distinctive, it is in our commitment to these values emerging from our tradition, not just using those buzzwords, as one of you said, but living them out in our concrete decision-making. It's at this point, if we were in person, that I would invite all of you still joining us on this webinar to applaud our panelists. I will do so on your behalf. Please know of our thoughts and prayers for you, your students, your faculty members, the members of all of your campus communities in this incredibly trying moment. Please know that there is a network of solidarity here and that all 5 of us are privileged to be part of it. Thank you all so very, very much indeed. Goodbye.